In this episode, we listen to Dr. Ray's first ramble entitled It's Context All the Way Down. Welcome to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm Dr. Shannon Ray, and it's nice to be back after a pretty long hiatus. A lot has happened since the last episode we recorded, which was the faith component, I believe. And one of those things that happened, which should be obvious, is that our co-host Oyani is no longer with us. And I just mean that he's no longer doing the podcast. And, that's okay. Everything's fine. He's just really busy. He has his own aspirations with his business and his freelance work and his design work. And given those obligations and those things that he has to get done, he just can't fit this into a schedule, which is something that I completely and totally understand. He's my brother. I love that guy. I always will. And, in this departure from the podcast, I just want all the listeners to wish him the best of luck in his endeavors. And I hope he's successful. And who knows, maybe one day the podcast will become something that can help support him and I, and maybe he'll be back someday. Who knows? But at the current moment, this is the state of things, and I'm okay with that. Oyani's okay with that. And, this is a good exercise in letting go and not being attached to things that are not guaranteed to be eternal or to last forever. And so, we wish Oyani the best. And yeah, so that's one thing that has changed in the recent months. On a different note, I would say a positive note, but I don't know. I don't feel like the loss of Oyani is a negative note. It's just different, life just keeps going. And so on a different note, I have my paper published. If you follow us on Instagram, then you might have already seen that. Or if you follow our Reddit post, or every once in a while I post on Reddit, you'll notice that I finally got my paper published, which is a huge relief. That paper required a lot out of me. It was not easy. There were moments in the process where I didn't believe I'd be able to find anything interesting or compelling. But I think that what I discovered is actually, I'm very proud of this work. The paper itself is called A Differential-Geometric Approach to Quantum Ignorance Consistent with Entropic Properties of Statistical Mechanics. My co-author, Carlo Coffaro, came up with that name. And this is the third version out of multiple attempts to get it published. We attempted in 2 previous journals and eventually settled on Entropy. And, a lot of people, if you ever listen to people criticize the peer review process, they usually mock it as being totally superfluous and non-helpful. But that hasn't been my experience. I feel like the referee reports that I got from the previous versions were really helpful. They really did point out some issues that could be improved with the paper. I took those criticisms constructively and used those to update the paper, modify it, make it better, make it sharper. And I feel like ultimately that's what the process did. And so this final version, I think, is the tightest version of the paper. And we got it published in the journal Entropy, where it is a featured article. So I'll just go onto their website real quick. Let's see. Yeah. So in Entropy, featured papers, it's a featured paper. And this is their description of featured papers. Featured papers represent the most advanced research with significant potential for high impact in the field. A featured paper should be a substantial original article that involves several techniques or approaches, provides an outlook for future research directions, and describes possible research applications. Featured papers are submitted upon individual invitation or recommendation by the scientific editors and must receive positive feedback from the reviewers. So, that's that's my paper. And, if anyone, wants to get something like, instead of just listening to me say I have a paper in Entropy in this journal and that it exists, if you want to listen to the podcast in a more active way, you can actually just go and Google it. And in fact, I will leave a link to the paper in the description of this episode. And you don't have to try to read it and break it all down unless you're a physicist or a mathematician and you actually are interested in breaking it down, in which case have at it. But but for the most part, it's just for people who aren't who for which this isn't their subject or interest. Just take a look at it and look at how it's laid out, look at the equations, look at the figures, and just, I don't know, I kind of appreciate it for its aesthetic beauty, because that was one of the reasons I got into physics in the first place, in mathematics. I got into it because when I was younger, I would see these really elaborate equations in papers or books, and I had no idea what they said. But clearly, these symbols are very intricate, and the way they're organized is very detailed. And so they clearly have to be saying something. And just the mere fact that just the mere aesthetic beauty called me to this field. And so in that case, when you look at this paper, just kind of understand, when you look at the detail and all the equations and everything, just understand, this is my heart and soul I put into this. And if you don't understand the technical details, at the very least, you can just look at how much work went into organizing this, so you can kind of comprehend what I had to do to get it done. So that's some positive information. I'm really happy about that. And so moving forward with the podcast, I am not derailed on my mission. Like I've said in previous episodes, this podcast and my communication of the ideas within it is something like a calling. It's something to where I don't feel like I have an option. This is something I have to do. I can't decide not to do it. The only thing I can imagine is if I didn't continue to communicate these ideas, is that I will get to some point in my life in which I'll look back and know that I didn't live my life. And I can only imagine how painful it would be to be near my deathbed, or to, look back in old age at this calling screaming at me to communicate these ideas and not responding to that. It would just be a betrayal of my conscience. So the podcast moves forward, and hopefully so the podcast moves forward, and hopefully the content is still engaging and people are still interested in listening to it. And so currently I do not have a co-host. This is just me on my own, but through the years, I have been recording myself whenever I have an idea. Like I said, it's a lot of times these ideas come almost like a muse that's speaking to you, and then you have to write it down on a piece of paper or record it to get a record of it, so that you can disseminate it later on, or just have it as a reference for yourself. But so given that, what I plan on doing right now until I figure out what I'm going to do next is release some of these recordings that I've done, my personal recordings. And these recordings, I refer to them as rambles. This is in reference to a friend of mine, Ted Ferguson, who was mentioned, I think, in the 6th episode of the first season, Speak Your Truth. At the end, I talked about someone I met on Reddit who was clearly resonating with the ideas that were being communicated, and was somebody someone whose soul is not a far distance from my own in terms of kind of piecing together reality and how we think of it. And so he has, I think he had a YouTube page called Ted Rambles, and he has a project online that is just his rambles, which is kind of like this process of like a stream of consciousness writing down his ideas. And so when I read his rambles for the first time, I was like, oh man, this really reminds me of my own process. and it spoke to me quite a bit. And so I started labeling my process as rambles. And so what I'm going to be releasing for the current moment are my rambles, for which I have probably 20 to 30 hours, if not more. And so I picked a specific ramble that I had been in the past considering for a podcast episode that I want to call Context All the Way Down, or It's Context All the Way Down. And this particular ramble is about context, and it starts off discussing some of the ideas in MC Owen's Lotus Underground podcast on the ideas of context. And I think that it was largely developed from his episode on the inconceivable state of Buddhahood that was recommended to me by Christopher, which, by the way, I gotta say, Christopher, if you're still listening, that that introduction, like sending me that email, sent me down a whole different path of reality, man. I've been getting really into Buddhism in depth, not only through MC Owens, but my own reading the sutras, usually sutras that MC Owens has read, but I go and find copies and read them myself and study them. My favorite being the Vajraprajnaparamita Sutra, and the Inconceivable State of Buddhahood Sutra. I forgot what the actual name. I think it's the Saguna Deva, but I think I mess up the Saguna part. I don't think that's the right word. But yeah, that's another one of my favorite ones. And I did memorize the entire Heart Sutra. So I have been definitely connecting with Buddhism. Not to say that I also haven't been connecting with Christianity a lot recently too. So those two have been my spiritual pillars as of late. But yeah, so Christopher, by suggesting that to me, and I also listened to Ajahn Brahm. So I don't know if you're familiar with Ajahn Brahm, but he's a Buddhist monk from the UK that lives in Australia, and he's phenomenal. So whenever I need some positive energy, I listen to that podcast. But I also listen to Father Mike Schmidt's Bible in a Year podcast. So I'm getting my mixtures of things. But yeah, this ramble is about, it was originally, the beginning of it was sparked by thinking about context from one of MC Owen's examples. And from there, it just kind of, it kind of just evolves wherever my mind goes. I mean, like, Ted understands it's a ramble. So it's like a stream of channeling this, whatever speaks to me to kind of like, communicate these ideas. And so I only ask that for people who are familiar with the previous format of the podcast, that they give this ramble a chance and they listen to it to the end, because I really am proud of it. I think that the quality of this ramble is just as good as the previous podcasts. The sound quality might not be as good because I recorded it on my phone. So, there's that, but I don't think it's too bad. I think it should be tolerable or even maybe decent. So yeah, give this a chance. Understand that in a few spots, the ideas some ideas trail off, but then they get picked up later on. So there's a lot of moments where it seems like I go off on a tangent, but then that tangent gets picked up later. And because it is kind of just a stream of consciousness recording, it's there will be places, I think, that are, not necessarily curated for, like, they are just my inner thoughts. They're a little more personal. This is a little more personal. So you're not going to see as a clean, polished version of myself, which I think is good, because releasing this particular content is an exercise of letting go, and letting go of trying to control my image and trying to control how people see me, and just letting go to communicate something from the heart. And I hope that people can hear that when they listen to this, and hopefully it connects with you. And given that, I ask for anyone who is new to the podcast, if this is the first time you've listened to it, or if you're a person who listens to it regularly, I ask that if you do find that this speaks to you or you find it compelling when you're listening to it, that you and you find this podcast, you find it maybe entertaining, you find it helpful, you find it insightful, it speaks to you, to your heart, that I put my heart into this and I want this to be a viable thing for myself in the future. So if you could support the podcast by just going and rating it on whatever podcast format you're listening to, or leaving a review wherever you can. And if you really want to help, recommending it to a friend, recommending it to someone who you think will get something out of this. And that's all I ask in return. So if you could do that for me, think of it as payment for the content, because the content's free. I don't charge anything. I don't have any ads. Currently, but I don't have any ads. So, and I'm not asking anyone for any money. So at the very least, can just consider as payment a recommendation to somebody. And if you can't do that, then just writing a review. And if you can't do that, then just hitting this, rating it. If you can't do that, just rating it. I would be very appreciative of that, and I would consider us square, I guess. I'm actually taking this route of engagement from a YouTuber I listen to named Jesse on Fire, where he says something like this, but I find it pretty clever. So hopefully it works. And so I guess with that, thank you for listening to this long introduction to my ramble. And I hope that you find that this content that you're about to listen to is just as good as the previous content. And I will be uploading this stuff regularly. So if you like it, keep listening. And I appreciate everyone who listens and takes the time to give me your ear and allow me to program you to see reality from the perspective of a theoretical physicist. Thank you. Peace.
I think I just came to a realization about context. So, starting from MC Owens talking about the inconceivable state of Buddhahood and the difference between the conditioned and the unconditioned. And you can imagine that completely unconditioning means there's nothing. Then you make one mark. That one mark still means nothing because there's no context. So even if you have a singular, then you still do not have information. You still do not have context. So you make a line. Then you draw a line through that line, say a perpendicular one. Then you draw a circle next to that. And then you draw what look like arches next to that. And then suddenly it looks like you said Tom. But during this whole process, it was just a line, a circle, and arches. If you had drawn the arches by itself, what could that mean? Pretty much anything. It could mean McDonald's, it could be an M, it could be an upside down W. It could be any meaning to that symbol that you want. The symbol on its own doesn't mean anything. But then you add another symbol. This is to add context. But you can think of each time that you add context, it's like a macro information. So you draw a line. That could be anything, but it's not a circle. And so when I draw a line, that line still can mean anything, but it's not a circle. So, because you can think of all the stuff you can put there, but you draw the line, and then you draw another symbol next to it. And then now that symbol can give the previous symbol meaning. And that's more context, but that's more information. So you've gone from a lower resolution model to a higher resolution model. The lower resolution model has more ignorance associated with it because it's only one symbol. But when I add another symbol, then potentially I can start meaning anything. Now, the adding of symbols does not mean anything unless you have a relationship between the symbols. So, in other words, if I were to draw a circle and M arches, and to do the Tom example, but there was no language for which Tom is a name, then you have to build a relationship with them. You have to tell a story about them. You have to tell a story that connects them together. And then the story, it has to say something coherent. So the relationship between the symbols has to be a coherent one, to where if I add in more symbols, they're all coherently related to each other. But so for it to be coherently related means that whatever relation you've created between the symbols can't contradict each other. So in other words, you're trying to create relationships between symbols because that's how the symbols can create context. So this is the purpose of language. And so, as I was saying before, in the Tom example, with the crosses and the circles and the arches, in that example, there is a language, English, for which the symbols of a cross, a circle, and arches means Tom. And so, as you start to make one line, straight line, then another straight line, it's like, okay, it's a straight line, not a circle. Another straight line, okay, it crosses that one perpendicularly, and then a small circle next to that, at the bottom. If this were a cross, it'd be at the bottom of the cross, and then upside down arches. That spells Tom, but that's only because you know the language before the symbols were made. If you didn't know the language that gives the meaning to the symbols, cross, circle, arches, to create Tom, then that still means absolutely nothing. The only way context can be created is if you have a coherent relationship between a set of symbols. And that coherent relationship tells you something about similarity, how one goes from the other, how far away they are from each other, how far is a circle from a T in terms of symbols. Well, they're both in the alphabet. In this case, we're saying or is it the alphabet? Well, they are symbols that could exist in the alphabet. I mean, there's a lot of, each symbol doesn't have one meaning. Like each symbol gains meaning based on the context. So we have the concept of a circle, of an O, of a loop. And then we think of all the ways we can use that. It can mean 0. It can mean O. It can mean, a ring. It can mean a bunch of stuff. And so we have this set of symbols. Then we have to have some means of creating a relationship between symbols that's coherent, that doesn't produce contradictions, such that the relationships are eternal. And this is the important part. For the relationships to be eternal means that they are objective, independent of any individual, because they are eternal. So in physics, these would be symmetries. These are the symmetries of the universe. Like when you're thinking of momentum, you're thinking about momentum and the idea that it's conserved. What does that mean? Well, think of it this way. At any given moment, the universe is evolving from one state to the other. Right now, there is someone throwing a baseball. There's an asteroid flying in deep space. There's water falling. All of these things are happening right now. And what I mean they're happening is that the universe is in a state. And it goes from one state to another state. And what I mean by state is the universe has some degrees of freedom and some settings of those degrees of freedom. And where the degree of freedom are the properties of the universe. They are properties. So you have degrees of freedom, which are concepts, which are properties, and they can have settings. And so if you have these concepts with their settings, then that can represent a state. So you can imagine all of the possible ways of conceptualizing the state of the universe. And at any given moment during any state that you've conceptualized, things are interacting with each other. Things are in motion. The asteroid, the water falling, the ball being thrown. These things are in motion. And so when the universe is evolving from one state to the next, it has to satisfy some constraints. These are the laws of physics. And so these constraints create symmetries, like momentum, that is a symmetry of the universe. When an interaction occurs such that the universe evolves from one state to another, it must be done such that the momentum is conserved. Meaning that the state of the universe in which everything suddenly stops interacting, there is no more motion, there is no more movement, that would not conserve momentum. You would go from having the universe having some momentum to now having zero momentum. This does not conserve the laws of physics. So that state of the universe in which it just stops is not consistent with the observed universe. Therefore, as far as we know, it is an invalid state of the universe, which means that at every single point in the trajectory of the evolution of the state of the universe, there must be motion. This is the conservation of momentum. This is a symmetry. And these symmetries must be satisfied like conservation of energy. These symmetries must be satisfied. And as physicists, these are the tools we conceptualize with. We take the things that we observe about the universe that are always eternally true. And it's there from which we build our model of reality. This is the physical. This is physics. This is what physics is. It is to conceptualize the universe, what state it's in and what state it will be in, using the symmetries of the universe, the things that are eternal and do not change with time. They are conserved. And so every single state of the universe that is possible is symmetric with the conserved quantities, with the laws of physics. And the laws of physics give a set of possible states the universe could be in versus the states that are not consistent with our laws of physics. And so when talking about the idea of an eternal, what we're talking about is something that is time symmetric. And so if you are building a language, that language creates context from which a world emerges, from which a conceptualization of reality emerges. And whether or not a conceptualization remains stable depends on if it's observed in the future. If it's always observed in the future in the same state as it was before, then it is symmetric or conserved. And so this is what Jordan Peterson is talking about in that video that I saw the other day on why the feminine represents chaos. Now, I don't know if I agree with his idea that the feminine represents chaos, but the description he was giving on how objective truth comes out of story was spot on. And so the whole point of this entire little rant came from the idea of context. This is me trying to explain that it's context all the way down. It's context in the sense that nothing means anything without its relationship to something else. And one of the things that are fundamental to a creator or a being of mind or an artist, one thing that's fundamental is the use of language to conceptualize. I think this is a distinguishing characteristic that distinguishes mind from not mind. Things that use language to conceptualize, to create meaning, and from the process of creating meaning, they can imbue spirit on things based off on how they interpret them, because those things evolve depending on what happens during an interaction. If you are a creator who can conceptualize reality, then you can conceptualize what that thing is meant to do. That's berries. They're meant to be eaten. And then they gain the spirit of food because of your relationship to it. So your relationship creates context for which meaning arises. And so you are a spirit giver. You give and create spirits. You imbue spirit on things. And when you imbue spirit on things, you determine its momentum. Because you can think of this, any object that you're imagining, whether it be a berry or a baseball or whatever it is. You can imagine that that thing is part of the universe. The universe is always evolving because it has to conserve the momentum. So it's always going from one state to the next. It can't just suddenly stop. If it does that, then the momentum is not conserved and violates the law of physics. So it's an invalid state of the universe, which means that at every single point when the universe goes from state A to state B, the momentum must be conserved. And so everything has momentum. Even if it seems still in your reference frame, there's a reference frame in which it has momentum. Oh, the ball seems still in your reference frame? Well, the Earth is actually rotating. It's rotating with respect to its axis. It's rotating with respect to the sun. It has no momentum? Yes, it does have momentum, depending on the context. And so as the universe evolves, everything has momentum at all times. Everything has momentum at all times. And when you interact with it based on how you think, what you think its purpose is, what spirit you imbue on it, when you interact with it that way, you are kind of carrying it, like you are evolving it. You're changing its momentum by transforming some of your momentum. There's an interaction between you and it, and momentum is conserved. Maybe you gained some information, some momentum, maybe it lost some. Maybe it lost some, maybe you gained some. But it's almost like we're all always falling. Constantly. Because this is where gravity comes from, I think. It comes from the fact of what I just said. Momentum is always conserved. Which means that things can't just suddenly stop. Which means they always have to be being dragged forward. With momentum, inertia. And so things are always being dragged forward. And so because of that, because you can't just stop the evolution of the universe without breaking the laws of physics, the universe is evolving in the space of configuration, in the space of its possible states as it's evolving. Every time you feel like you're being pulled into the future, it's because everything has momentum. You are being pulled. You're falling into it. The universe just can't stop evolving. That's gravity. That's gravity. And I think this is precisely why Einstein was having such a trouble with trying to generalize his theory to accelerating reference frames. Because when you have an accelerating reference frame, you're creating momentum. And so it becomes difficult to distinguish gravity from an accelerating reference frame. But the thing that I want to emphasize is the fact that through our conceptualizing what reality is, we create meaning. We conceptualize using language, which creates meaning, which allows us to interpret things, to give them spirit, which allows us to interact with them in accordance with our will and what we think that thing is. And the more we do that, the more we create. That's the process of creation. So we are creators. We are gods. We are God beings who create reality. Somehow the universe evolves such that conscious beings come into existence that can perceive. And I think that occurs, and this is going to sound like it's going out in a leap, but I think that occurs due to the formation of black holes. In other words, I think that formations of black holes are a problem of the universe not having enough machine precision or enough data to resolve too much information in one location. So, in other words, what I'm saying is there's a machine precision of the universe. I'm trying to describe the state of the universe using the degree of freedom soup. This is like the degree of freedom soup is how we conceptualize state. Degrees of freedom are properties, position, momentum, as examples that can have values. And depending what the values are of the position and momentum and energy of every single set of matter, all things that can be molded, you give a setting of all the possible degrees of freedom they can all have. And that would be the state of the universe. Which, given nomentation without representation, a state where Shannon is sad is different than a state where Shannon is happy. Those are two different settings of the degrees of freedom of Shannon. So it's not just saying conceptualize with a degree of freedom soup using physics ideas. Whatever idea you can come up with to create meaning, but you must use a language. And these languages require consistency. It requires objective relation between symbols, such that the cross and the circle and the arches means Tom. Whereas if there were no language, then those symbols would mean nothing. They'd be free symbols. You'd have the freedom to place whatever meaning you want in the symbols. You'd have the freedom to create the relationship between the symbols. But if the relationships you create are inconsistent, meaning there isn't anything fixed over time, there isn't anything eternal, then it can't create meaning reliably. So you have the symbols, you have the relationships between them, and that creates a language. And then once you have a language, once you get data, that starts creating context. You get one piece of data, that's one bit of that's some context. It's very blurry, low resolution. This is the first line in Tom. Ugh, that could mean anything. A straight line? What the fuck could that mean? That could mean anything. Very, very coarse. Very blurry. It's not a circle though, but it's a straight line. That could mean anything. Oh, you put another straight line, perpendicular. Okay, that could mean a cross. It could mean a T. It could mean a crossing. It could mean pretty much anything, but it's two lines, not one line. And the lines don't intersect in the middle. So, okay. Now, it could mean anything for that. And then you put the little circle. Oh, now it looks like you're spelling something. T-O. Every time you add another more context, you are giving higher resolution data. You're going from a coarser understanding what the thing could be to a higher dimensional space with more information. And then you put the arches. It's like, I think there's a very good chance this means Tom. But you never know. Is that all the symbols? Is that all the symbols? Is it possible that those symbols could mean something else in some other language that you're unaware of? It's possible. So it might not be Tom. But then someone says, yes, we were playing Hangman. And the letters and what I was trying to say was indeed Tom. Then you're like, another God who is communicating with me has given me the context in which the creation occurred. Now I can be very, very certain what this means. It's Tom. And that last bit of the other creator telling their creative process is a lot of data that really narrows down what the fuck the thing could be. Then you ask yourself more about the creator. Oh, the creator is an English speaker. Oh, the creator has a dad named Tom. And then you're like, okay, that makes it even stronger. There's even more context. And the more context you give, the higher precision, the more a world emerges. You see how we went from crosses, circles, arches, hangman, Tom, English, hangman, Tom, dad named Tom. Then every time you add that, it's like, what is an English speaker? You have to explain what that is. And every single time you add more context, it's like the world just emerges out of it. And now suddenly you went from this very coarse thing that was blurry with one cross to, we are in the reality in which English is a spoken language, and that there are people who speak it and that are native and people who aren't, and people who, who speak other languages. So there's a world where there's other languages. And it's like, we could have been talking about a D&D world. We could have been talking about a sci-fi world in which these things aren't true. But as you give more and more data, and that's the whole point. That's the same thing you're doing when you just go out into the world. When you just go out into the world, you are going out there and you're constantly taking in data. And as you're slowly seeing things evolve, you're getting more context. And then you can start to project into the future. You start recognizing, okay, well, there's momentum that has to be conserved. So if this image that I'm looking at continues, given the momentum I've observed after looking at several frames, that motherfucker's gonna get hit by a car. And then, whoom, they get hit by a car. Because you knew that the person couldn't stop in time. You knew the person couldn't evade. You know, the person driving couldn't stop in time. The person couldn't evade. Because the person was pushed suddenly. You saw that part. So you saw the person go to push. Oh, I know what the momentum of that looks like. I know what's going to happen next. So you just watch it. And the more data you take in, the more certain you are of what things are going to be. And you always up to the point where the universe goes from the past to the present to the future. There's always a chance that it throws a curveball. But as you get closer and closer from the past to the present, where there's less of a time difference between them, there's a certain point to where there is no amount of force or anything that can be done in the world that can stop this event from occurring. Once you've crossed the line to where you would need more energy that exists in the universe to prevent this from occurring, you've crossed the event horizon of the black hole. Because remember, this entire description is to explain gravity. Well, not entirely. I mean, I'm kind of going around in circles. I'm just rambling, honestly. But it's a pretty good ramble, so I'm gonna keep on doing it. And maybe I'll post it on the podcast. But so you have to look at the present, the past, the present, and the future. And as the past and the present, you can think of, oh, there's an event that's going to happen an hour from now. Oh, it's going to happen 30 minutes from now, 15 minutes from now, And every single time you break it down in half, and you keep going half, you're going to get to a point to where you are looking at a time difference on the order of something like 10 to the negative whatever, 10 to the negative 5, 10 to the negative 15 seconds, 10 to the negative 20 seconds or whatever. But you can't keep doing this forever, because there's a certain point in which the amount of energy, like if it's at 10 to the negative 15 seconds between the past and the future, or the past and the present, or 10 to the negative 30 or 40, how small can you get that before suddenly the universe, like there is no more information to resolve a difference? Oh, 10 to the negative 25, 26, 30, I don't know. Probably getting down at the Planck scale at this point. Wish I knew that on top of my head, but I don't, because I can look that shit up. So I don't keep shit like that in my head. It's too much energy, too much work. Just look it up. Even though I pay for it later when I have to look it up instead of just having it in my head like I wish I had now. But whatever. Keeping all that shit in your head is hard. And one of the things that I've learned is that, and maybe this is part of maybe I'd be a better physicist if I actually took the time to sit down and do more rote memorization and just like practice and look at symbols. Like, that shit's tiring, man. And I do it all day at work. And I simply don't have time. Like, no one's going to give me time to just sit and memorize symbols and shit. There's never any time. You're always being rushed. You got an assignment to hand in, you got a test, you got a blah. It's like you're always being dragged into the future, pulled by something that just won't let you just stop. So that's why I don't do that, because I don't love physics enough to dedicate every waking second to trying to become a better physicist. I have other shit I want to do. I mean, I've dedicated a lot of time into this. So, I don't know, doing my best. But, that's the whole point, is that as the universe, the momentum of the universe, as it's evolving, it's going through a trajectory in the space of all configurations the universe can be in, all states of the universe, the space of configurations of the universe. When you're going, I think there's a certain point to where once you hit, So what I'm trying to explain, which I went on a long tangent from earlier, but what I'm trying to explain, see if I can recall, is the idea of how consciousness can arise. You might have to go way back to remember that, but there was an idea of how consciousness arises. And I said something about black holes and, quantum, I think quantum gravity and black holes might be the description. And I went on this long tangent. I was trying to explain the idea of how a black hole occurs through basically, I think they occur due to ignorance, due to a lack of information. I think there's a certain point to which if you tried to ask someone what the state of the universe was, if you tried to ask someone what is the state of the universe, and to say exactly what the state of the universe is, to say it exactly, you would need concepts that are correct to infinite precision. So something that has some sort of conceptual structure that has infinitely precise concepts. Then you would need infinitely precise settings of those concepts. So the concepts are the degrees of freedom, and then you have to give what are the settings of the degrees of freedom. And if you did that for all energy and matter in the universe, you'd have a state, but you'd have to give infinitely precise concepts and infinitely precise values, like position, momentum of every particle, of everything in the universe. Energy. How much energy do they have? How much kinetic energy? How much potential energy? All that stuff. Happy, sad. Every way you can conceptualize. That's the whole point. The bottom turtle, we're trying to generate all logically sound ways of conceptualizing the universe. So you want to say what the state of the universe is exactly. So because saying what the universe is exactly requires infinite information and infinitely precise concepts, information about the state of the universe has to be stored in matter and energy. The structure of it. That's where the information is stored. So in other words, you have to think about two billiard balls colliding with each other. And you can think of their position, momentum, and angular momentum, all that stuff. You can think of that as like the settings. Like when I hit a cue ball on a pool table, it's a pool stick. It's like I'm writing instructions on it. Like I'm imbuing it with settings. So I'm imbuing it with settings. And when it collides with the other ball, whether or not you successfully hit the ball in the hole depends on whether or not you've properly programmed by putting the settings in. And so you're like coding up the settings. And so whatever settings you've given it, you can imagine that there's a way of making a measurement to extract that data. And so you can make more and more precise measurements to get more and more precise data. And so when you're reading it by making these measurements, you're essentially like reading off the data that was encoded on it when you hit it. And so you have to think of that encoded data as being like something on a spreadsheet. When you hit it with this much momentum, up to 7.456321845, these numbers go on forever. And it's like, this information is physically stored on the cue ball when you hit it, because I can make a measurement and I can extract that data. So it's clearly there, physically. And so you have to imagine that when you're trying to program it, can you program it to infinite precision? Is there infinite paper, using the analogy of the cue ball as being like a spreadsheet with the values of what you've programmed on it? There's a certain point in which that cue ball only has a finite amount of energy and matter to only give a finite value of the settings. And so because of that, there's always an information limit. This is what I mean by the machine precision of the universe. There's an information limit. And that information limit tells you the degree to which the universe is not defined. It's not well defined. There's ignorance there. And so if there's ignorance there, then that means as the universe is evolving with this momentum stuff being conserved, there's always a degree to which you don't know what the future state will be. There's only things that are consistent with the settings of the cue ball up to the machine precision of the universe. After that, it's uncertain. You can only know it up to some machine precision. 40 digits, 34 digits or something. After that, nothing. It could be anything. That's the symmetry. Those are the symmetries. Those are the things consistent with the settings. But there's freedom there. There's a degree to which the universe isn't defined. And that creates ignorance. Which means that you don't know what the future state of the universe is going to be. Now imagine a future state of the universe in which there's no ignorance about what the state will be. That is something that is not changing. There is no ignorance. When things don't change, there's no ignorance. There's no time. It's like the whole point of stopping momentum everywhere. And so I think that us being dragged into the future has to do with like these information voids. And this is what my research is about. I mean, this is what I want to write the paper on my work, is that I've created the surfaces of ignorance. The gauge that emerges from ignorance, from a lack of information. And I know I didn't describe well about how consciousness arises, but what I'm trying to say is that interactions inherently create ignorance or chaos or uncertainty or entropy. It creates that ignorance or lack of information. And so when I think of consciousness, I think of it emerging. I think of something like a very complicated system. I think complexity is a necessary requirement for consciousness to emerge. And when I mean complexity, I mean precisely something like there is an interaction that occurs in the universe, or there is a set of interactions, or there's some sort of interaction that occurs from which the universe is going from one state to the next. And this interaction is sufficiently complicated such that if you tried to mathematically model the interaction using a Taylor expansion, that it wouldn't be zeroth order, which is a constant. Zeroth order is a flat line. It's constant. It's a constant value. F at 0 is 7. 7. That's it. The number 7. That's it? Okay. But what about the first order? A linearization, a first derivative. Okay. The second order. Second derivative. Third order, fourth order, fifth order, sixth order, seventh order, eighth order, ninth order, 10th order. The complexity has to do with, well, I mean, actually the order is not, because, the whole thing is sines and cosines have infinite order, but they're repeating. They're repeating. So it's not just the orders. It's not just the order of the number of derivatives in the Taylor expansion, because sine and cosine just repeats itself over and over and over and over and over and over again. So there's not that much information in there, actually. I think it has to be something that's non-repeating. Anyway, the description of this thing, I think, and maybe someone can correct me on this, I think I might have fucked this up, but whatever, is I think that when you're trying to model the universe going from one state to the next, if you have some sort of sufficiently complicated, chaotic system, and you're trying to model the evolution of that thing, a function to model the evolution of it, this complex interaction, and there might be a more sophisticated way of saying this. So if anyone's listening to this, please don't think I'm an idiot and just kind of like correct me and point me in the right direction. That'd help. But I think that there's a certain point to where with these different tangent spaces that you're using, these higher order derivatives, that again, there's a certain point where you can't have an infinite number of these derivatives. Like you can't have an infinite number of information, an infinite amount of information. There's a certain point where the thing becomes too complex to where there's like a certain collapse. And I know this is just completely speculative. Like, this isn't even remotely, like, I've veered off significantly from more solid foundations of physics. Now I'm just kind of rambling, and I wouldn't trust this shit at all. But it's fun. It's what I like to muse about. And I like to try to connect the dots as I do it, which is what I'm constantly doing. It's like my hobby to just think about this stuff. That's why I want to share it with you guys with the podcast. I want you to see the world in the way that I see it. Not because I want you to just believe what I say or just follow me blindly or something. It's because I think that the laws of physics and mathematics and languages of mathematics create extremely precise languages. And in those precise languages, that was a weird way of saying that. And in those precise languages, it has a lot of symbols and a lot of meaning between them and a lot of consistency between them to create logically sound structures. So, like, the language has an effect on how you think, but it doesn't determine what you think. That's why I want to conceptually share a language, just so that we can communicate on stuff with more solid ground. Because again, as a physicist, what it means to be a physicist is to conceptualize the universe using the symmetries of the universe. And so when you try to make an argument as to what the universe is and how it evolved and all that stuff, you start from the physical and you start by explaining how the physical behaves and evolves, what states it can be found in, how those, explain those states, how they go from one state to the other. And I feel like the whole main thing that I'm trying to do is just do that with common sense ideas. Like, I feel like there's a lot of common sense information or symbols out there, and there's a lot of lack of vision, difficulty of perceiving the relationship between them, because people just can't step back and look at the whole picture. And I think to really be able to step back and look at the whole picture, you almost have to yourself, within yourself, build a language big enough to encapsulate all of it. And then once you've built that, and you start looking at whether or not the concepts you've constructed are logically consistent with common sense, like, oh yeah, I think I got everything. Yep, this all makes sense. And so it's like, I really want people to understand what it's like to be a physicist. Like, I really want people to understand what that's like. To go from being a 15-year-old kid and study for like 17 years. Like, I'm trying to tell you, once I studied for 45 hours in a 3-day time period. 15 hours, 3 days straight. 15 hours, 3 days straight. That is sacrifice, man. And in return of a sacrifice that immense, to work that hard I wasn't working that hard for 17 years. My undergrad years were pretty laxed, but I've been working my ass off just to you just have to be learning concepts and languages every day just to keep up. And so, like I said earlier, it feels like you never have time to reflect on it. And so as I get older, you can't just continually learning new mathematically precise languages every single day for like 20 some odd years, just reading research papers every fucking day and not have it change how you see the world. That makes no sense. You have to see that. Unless you're saying that unless you're saying that I'm either not a physicist or that physicists don't have worlds this rigorous and complex and precise. You guys all know who Albert Einstein is, right? You know who Richard Feynman is? Those are the worlds that I create in. That is just like an everyday fucking occurrence for me. Oh, read this paper on black holes. Oh, read this paper on quantum. Oh, read this paper on computational geometry. Ooh, read this paper on optimization. Ooh, read this paper on linear algebra techniques. Ooh, read this paper on thermodynamics. Ooh, read this paper on quantum physics. Or I already said quantum physics. It's just every day. And the more you do it, the more things compress. because you're just doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. Like I was saying earlier about one way I could become a better physicist if I took more time for it to do more rote memorization. But Jesus, man, like I have dedicated so much, and I know based off my works of art that I've created in these realms that I'm not an imposter. I am a genuine, real fucking physicist. And because of that, I have all of these mathematical languages and tools to conceptualize reality that most people do not have. You simply do not have my sight. You don't. And I don't have the sight of an MMA fighter. I don't have a sight of an opera singer. I don't have the sight of name anything. That's not my reality. And all those other realities that I just mentioned, when you play more games, you gain more experience, and the more different types of games you play, the more information you gain, and then the more relationship you see between them, the more you compress your world, the denser the language you have to conceptualize. This is just the process of becoming a more enlightened person. This is growing up. And you're not going to have that happen doing the same shit every day. Because eventually, things don't change. You're just getting the same data as before. And so, it is worth your while to have hobbies. It is worth your while to have relationships with as many people as you can. Because every time you interact with someone who's very different from you in a loving way in which you share each other's realities, the more virtual experience and actual experience you get. And from that experience, you have more concepts and ideas with relationships that you can use to conceptualize with, to create a higher precision language so that you can create meaning using more symbols that have consistent relationship between each other. And this is just what it means to be a mind, I think. And so if you want to be a more powerful mind, a more powerful creator, a more powerful artist, you need to make sacrifices to a God to gain their sight. The God of science, the God of physics, the God of mathematics, the God of algebra, the God of truth, the God of reason. You want to hear a sacrifice to the God of reason? Someone made a political statement I don't like and makes me feel uncomfortable. Okay, I can lash out. I can take my first immediate feeling and respond to that and just allow that to animate me. Or I can understand that that is not how a reasoned person behaves, a person who has fealty to the God of reason. So you eat the initial response and then you stop. And then you say, the God of reason demands me to not respond this way to you. The God of reason demands that I understand my bias, but I must eat this so I can have a genuine dialogue such that I can gain potentially more experience, so that I can have better precision data, potentially, so that I can fit that data into my model, so I can conceptualize the state of the universe, so I can conceptualize the spirit of the thing I'm interacting with high fidelity, accurately. There's a sacrifice to the God of reason. It's simple. It is a spirit you can have a relationship with. You make deals with it. You bargain with it. And if you lashed out and slapped somebody and you hadn't done that in 10 years because you had been adhering to the God of reason or the God of whichever thing stops you from slapping that person, it's going to be disappointed in you and you will feel guilt and it will be painful. Because that is the other inside of you, your Ava, your God machine, that is punishing you because you made a bargain with a God. Your subconscious holds that, says, oh, this is a virtue, a value you have. You adhere to the rules of this. You said that you would pledge fealty, and then you broke that promise. Your yeses were not yeses, and your nos were not nos. And as such, you are punished by your God. And you feel guilt, and you feel pain. It's just not how reality works. Causally. And the thing is, you can always say, bah, meh. That's not how I conceptualize God. There are many ways of conceptualizing God. It's like, I don't care. I just spent an hour explaining to you the context of the meaning of my words. I don't really give a fuck. Just listen to what I'm saying. And is what I'm saying logically consistent or not? Use this context to not allow me to program the meaning of that word on how I see it and view it is to not listen. It is to not want to communicate. I just spent an hour explaining what I meant by that, I think. And so it's like that concept of someone going, 2 plus 2 doesn't have to equal 4. It could equal 5. Okay, no, stop. We got to put an end to that. No one should ever say such nonsense ever again. Here are your options on this. Either the concept of 2, the concept of plus, the concept of equal, and the concept of 4 has its meaning imbued on it based on the context of the mathematical structures that have been developed by humanity, the arithmetic, the symbols, that's where those meanings come from, the gods of mathematics. Either it has those meanings, and if it does, then 2 plus 2 equals 5 is objectively wrong. So no. Or your other option is, okay, 2 plus 2 is removed. 2, the symbol 2, the plus, the equals, the 4, or the 5, whatever. All those symbols are no longer using the context of math to imbue meaning on them. Well, now they can mean anything until you build a relationship, you build a language, you build a structure that can place them in context, which means until you develop your own mathematical language to imbue meaning on those symbols don't fucking mean anything. So yeah, 2 plus 2 can equal 5, but that's only outside of a context in which mathematics is not imbuing meaning on those symbols. In which case, there is no context to imbue meaning on them, which means they don't mean anything. So no, actually, you can't just say, 2 plus 2 could equal 5, who's to say it can't? People who have no idea how to think, that's who would say that. Sorry, getting a little riled up. It's just how I am. I get very annoyed by a lot of things. I struggle a lot to not lash out. It's just constant. But I've gotten better. Say struggle. I've gotten a lot better. I know gonna make me feel bad about the progress I've made. Oof, I'm a lot better than I used to be. But that's the point of what I'm trying to say about my use of the word God. I spent an hour explaining the context of what I meant by that. And then someone comes along and goes, oh, well, it's like, do you want to listen to what I'm saying or not? Do you want to just hear the word God and be triggered to say that it's stupid? Or do you want to actually listen to what I'm saying? It's your choice. Either you're going to allow me to create a world, which is the context to imbue meaning on these concepts so I can communicate what I mean by when I say things, or you don't. It's up to you. Unless you want to attack the structure of what I've made up so far, which there's a few places that are weak, but I think for the most part, it's pretty good, especially when you put it in context with the entire podcast of 20. You put this little thing that I just said right here in context with the rest of the podcast that Oyani and I have recorded, and it would be pretty hard, I think, to just dismiss everything I'm saying outright, unless you're just completely unwilling to listen to what I'm saying. Like we were saying in the pointing in the continuum. Like, how can you say you want to love others and have loving relationships with them if you're not willing to try to find or to listen to them? How can I find the settings so that I can hear them clearly? And that's what it means to be sincere. That's what it means to listen sincerely. How do I change my settings so that I can receive this message as clearly as possible? What's the most charitable interpretation I can give of this? Oh, well, there's a lot of logical inconsistencies here, so I can't give it too much charity because it doesn't make any sense. It's logically inconsistent. That's logically inconsistent. Oh, but it's factually wrong. So I disagree here. That's what it means to be loving, because you're trying to find, okay, is this a logically sound structure? Oh, it seems pretty logically sound. A few things I disagree with, but for the most part, it creates a world that can create context. It's a language that you can see with. So then you listen to it. You listen to their arguments and ideas, and the extent to which they're either factually wrong or, factually wrong, meaning that you can't make predictions with it reliably, or someone says, did you know Bill Clinton was abducted by aliens in 2004? And it's like, well, can I use that information to reliably predict something like going online and seeing the footage of him being abducted? Just like Chris Rock being slapped by Will Smith? Someone said that Chris Rock smacked Will Smith at the Oscars, but there was absolutely no, that's his claim, that shit was recorded. So that means I should be able to go to an archive somewhere like the internet and find images and footage and data correlated to the concept of an Oscar and the concept of a Will Smith and the concept of a Chris Rock and a concept of being slapped on stage. I don't know, man. It's just my ramblings. Shout out to Ted. Ted Rambles. I like his idea of rambles. It's a really good idea. Essentially what this is. That's essentially what the entire podcast is made of. I have hours and hours of rambles on my phone, hours and hours of rambles typed up on, pages of rambles typed up on my computer. I got rambles everywhere. The podcast is just me cobbling these things together, essentially. Talking about them with Oyani. I just want to live in a shared reality where we're not arguing over the concepts. We can argue over what their settings should be. If you have a rich enough space with a large enough dimension, there's a lot of freedom in making the settings. You can say a lot. You can say a lot that's different than what the other person's saying. You don't need control over the concepts, as long as the concepts are fair. So how do you make them fair? Oh, how about we make the concepts associated with how a physicist conceptualizes reality? Where we use symmetries, objective datas, eternal concepts that are based on how the universe evolves, the nature of the universe, the symmetries of the universe. Let's use those to conceptualize reality. Well, how do we do that? Oh, well, that's the point of the Bottom Turtle podcast. To do that, That's what we're trying to do. It's certainly what we say we're trying to do. If you have any interaction with any data correlated to our podcast, are we successful? I would like for people to actually listen to it and tell me. Anyway, I gotta go to bed. Peace.